All right, so everybody ready for a deep dive? We're going green today.
Going green.
Yeah, we're diving into St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, coming right up.
Big day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, obviously a huge celebration, and we all think about green beer and parades.
Mm-hmm.
But, what's the story behind all of that? Where did this all begin? And how did it become what we know today?
Yeah, and I think, if anyone's ever taken a look at, St. Patrick's Day celebrations around the world,
Yeah.
It's easy to see that there's a really distinct visual identity to the holiday now.
Absolutely.
And, we've got a couple of sources here from time and history that we're going to be taking a look at.
Yeah.
They really helped us kind of uncover some really interesting and honestly unexpected kind of layers to the history of this holiday.
For sure. So, for everybody listening out there, we're going to unearth the surprising origins and the journey of St. Patrick's Day. You ready for this?
Let's do it.
Okay. Buckle up. So let's start right at the beginning with the main man himself, St. Patrick. Who is this guy? Really?
Okay, well, this is maybe a surprise to some people out there, but St. Patrick, he wasn't even Irish.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
He wasn't Irish?
He was not Irish. Both time and history are very clear about this. He was born a Roman citizen.
Okay.
In Britain.
In Britain.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got a Brit.
Yeah.
Who somehow becomes the patron saint of Ireland.
Yeah. And it's
what's the connection there?
It's a really pretty dramatic story. According to both of these sources, around the age of 16, he was captured by Irish raiders.
Okay.
And he was brought to Ireland as a slave.
Wow.
Yeah, and so he spent a number of years there before, either escaping or possibly being released.
Okay, so he gets away. He's like, I am out of here, back to Britain, never going back to that place.
Right, and you would think end of story.
Yeah, right.
But not so fast. He actually later felt a calling to return to Ireland, this time as a priest. And, he's credited with bringing Christianity to the island. Successfully converting many of the people there, including some of the religious leaders of the time, the Druids.
So the Druids, these were
these
sort of spiritual guides in Ireland before Christianity?
Yeah, they were like the priests of the old Irish religion.
Gotcha. Okay, so from captive to this influential religious figure.
That's right.
That's a pretty big swing.
Yeah, it is.
And March 17th, why that date? Why do we celebrate it on that day every year?
Well, because that's the day that he's believed to have died sometime in the 5th century. So, the holiday is really a way of commemorating his life.
Okay, so we got this historical figure, we got the roots of the holiday there, but how does this day of remembrance become this, huge cultural celebration that we see all around the world?
Right.
How do we get there?
Well, St. Patrick's Day, first started as a formal Catholic feast day.
Okay.
Time T tells us that this was officially established in 1631.
That seems kind of late,
Yeah, you think so, right?
Considering he lived so long before.
Yeah, you would think that they would have maybe gotten on that a little sooner. But the thing is, the Irish had already been observing it, in some way as a religious holiday for over 1,000 years. History points that out. So traditionally, this holiday was celebrated in a very specific way. Families would go to church in the morning for Mass.
Okay.
And then the afternoon was kind of set aside for celebration.
Okay, and I remember reading also there was this thing about Lent.
Yeah.
It's connected to Lent somehow.
Because March 17th often falls during Lent when certain foods are restricted.
Yeah.
For St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
Those restrictions were lifted, particularly the restrictions on eating meat.
Okay.
History even mentions that a traditional meal on St. Patrick's Day was Irish bacon and cabbage.
Okay, I'm putting a pin in that.
All right.
We're going to come back to that later, but first let's talk about the shamrock. We see it everywhere. It's on every piece of St. Patrick's Day paraphernalia that you can think of.
What's the story behind this little 3-leaf clover? Why is it such a big deal?
Okay, so the most well-known legend that we have says that St. Patrick used the 3 leaves of the shamrock to explain this concept of the Holy Trinity.
Right.
The idea that, God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all existing as one being. Time even references Caleb Threlkeld, who was an Irish botanist who in 1726 wrote about this connection between the shamrock and the Holy Trinity, and also noted that the shamrock was a recognized emblem of the holiday and of Ireland itself.
Okay, so it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
to explain this big theological concept.
Yeah.
Something that's so, simple and everywhere.
Yeah, you just pick it up off the ground.
But, is there actually historical proof that that happened? Did he actually do that?
Okay, well, this is where it gets interesting because most historians believe that this story is probably more legend.
That fact. Time even cites National Geographic.
Okay.
Which suggests that the plant itself, associated with this legend, might even be mythical. Not a specific species,
right?
Of clover in the botanical sense.
Interesting.
But, the association is there regardless of whether or not it actually happened, and it, became something more over time.
Right. So if it wasn't always, the symbol of Ireland, when did that association really solidify? When did it become this icon?
Well, Time says that the shamrocks association with Ireland really solidified in the 18th century. Especially during times of rebellion against British rule. It became the symbol of, of Irish identity and resistance.
Okay, so we got the shamrock. Now let's talk about green.
All right.
I mean, you can't talk about St. Patrick's Day without talking about the color green.
Yeah.
Why is green so closely connected to St. Patrick's Day?
Well, you would think, right, that it's because of, Ireland being called the Emerald Isle.
Right, yeah.
All the greenery. But the truth is the connection to green is primarily political.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Timothy McMahon told Time that it goes all the way back to the Great Irish Rebellion of 1641.
Okay.
In which the Catholic leaders of the rebellion used a green flag.
Okay.
With a harp on it.
So again, we see these political movements really influencing the symbols of the holiday.
Exactly. And green, continued to gain momentum during the Irish Rebellion of 1798.
Okay.
And a big part of this was a ballad called The Wearing of the Green.
Okay.
Which really popularized green as a symbol of Irish nationalism.
Okay. And so what color was associated with Ireland, before all this green?
Well, interestingly enough, before these rebellions, blue was actually the color that was most closely associated with Ireland.
So blue.
Yeah.
Interesting how things change.
Yeah. I mean, historical events can just completely transform, the meaning of things like colors.
Absolutely. Now, here's something that really surprised me when we were researching this episode. The first St. Patrick's Day parades didn't even happen in Ireland.
Yeah, that's true.
They weren't in Ireland.
They were not. The first recorded St. Patrick's Day parade was held in St. Augustine, Florida.
Florida, yeah.
All the way back in 1601.
Wow.
Yeah. At that time, Florida was a Spanish colony.
Right.
And history tells us that this event was organized by an Irish vicar named Ricardo Arter. And so that's kind of an interesting...
That's wild.
Yeah.
Florida, 1601.
Yeah.
Never would have guessed.
It's interesting to consider... You know how St. Patrick's Day started as an Irish holiday?
Right.
But even the way that we celebrate it really wasn't born in Ireland.
Yeah.
But took root in the experiences of Irish immigrants elsewhere.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And when do we see these big parades in cities like New York and Boston? When do those start?
So those came a bit later. Both time and history mentioned Irish soldiers who were serving in the English military, marched in Boston in 1737, and New York City in 1762. But the real kind of explosion in popularity for these parades, especially in American cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, came from just this massive wave of Irish immigrants who arrived in the U.S., during the 19th century. And, for these immigrants, facing a new and sometimes challenging environment in America, this was a way for them to hold on to their heritage, to express it. And history tells us that a lot of this was driven by Irish aid societies, such as the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick and the Hibernian Society. And these organizations, they held these annual parades, that often featured bagpipes and drums. And then in 1851, the various Irish aid societies in New York City, they decided to kind of join forces and hold a unified parade. And that became what is known as the New York City St. Patrick's Day Parade.
And that is still an absolutely massive event.
Oh, yeah. It's huge. History says that it's now recognized as the world's oldest civilian parade.
Wow.
And the largest in the U.S. with over 150,000 participants.
Wow.
And nearly 3 million spectators.
That's wild.
And the parade itself takes over 5 hours.
That's a long parade.
Yeah, to complete.
Right. Last but not least, food. We got to talk about the food.
Okay.
Here in the U.S., corned beef and cabbage is like this St. Patrick's Day meal.
Right.
Is it actually traditionally Irish, though?
Okay, so the short answer is no.
No.
It is not. Both of our sources here are very clear about that.
Oh.
Corned beef and cabbage is not a common dish in Ireland. Time explains that Irish immigrants in the U.S., they were used to eating bacon.
Okay.
But bacon was expensive in the U.S.,
Okay.
and so they found a cheaper alternative that had been preserved with large grains of salt.
Hence the term corned beef.
Corned beef, yeah.
Okay.
And they paired that with cabbage, which was also cheap and plentiful.
Okay, so it's like this Irish-American tradition that was born out of...
Yeah, it's out of necessity and what was available to them.
Oh.
So I guess you're not going to find too much corned beef and cabbage.
Yeah, you might find it now.
In Ireland.
Because
Okay.
It's become popular.
Right.
But it wasn't not traditionally Irish.
Traditionally Irish, no.
Okay. Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening deep dive.